Hello and welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival 2016. The DIF is curated by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation as an online open access event for thought leaders, entrepreneurs, businesses, designers, educators, makers, learners and doers from around the world.
1 week into the DIF, in this, its third year, we continue to explore the question, the economy is changing. What do I need to know, experience and do?
My name is Jules.
And I'm Zara.
We're part of the education team here at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and we're truly delighted to be joined today by Sir Ken Robinson and Peter Senge for this, which is their first ever online discussion. Hello, Peter, who's coming in from just outside of Boston.
Hello.
Hey. And Ken, who's coming in from LA.
Hi there. Hi.
Great. So you can find out more about the work of these two thought leaders on the DIF headliner session page.
What connects Peter and Ken is their interest in human potential and how we can fulfill our full potential, both as individuals and collectively, be it in schools, businesses, or other settings.
This headliner is pre-recorded, and you, the DIF audience, have submitted many questions from social media, which we will be feeding into the discussions as much as possible. Today, we're asking Ken and Peter to share their vision for the future of education, mapping out the key characteristics of an effective education system. I'd like to start us off with a question from Laura on Twitter, who asked, schools used to be the answer. So what is the answer now? And if I could get you to kick us off with that one, Ken, thanks.
Well, thanks, Jules. I think schools are still the answer. The issue, though, is that we have to rethink what a school is. And we've come to think of schools as particular sorts of institutions, housed in buildings with routines and algorithms and established habits and ways of doing things. And most of those features, or very many of them, I think, are obsolete. One reason for that is that school systems our current ones were largely conceived and implemented on a mass scale during the 19th century to meet the needs of the Industrial Revolution. And a lot of them share the institutional characteristics of industrial production. It's important not to run too far away with that idea, but some of it's certainly true. They're very linear organizations. The days are organized for batching people through the system in large groups. People progress through it by age group. They get carved up in high schools into lumps of time, typically. The days divide into subjects and specialisms and so on. Most of those features are really rooted in ideas of efficiency, but they don't really correspond to how people like to learn for the most part. It's why I think kids who are born with a fantastic appetite and interest in learning from the minute they open their eyes start to lose interest in it as they progress through the education system. It's not because they don't want to learn, it's because they don't respond very often positively to the way we try to educate them, because these systems themselves don't resonate deeply with the natural rhythms and appetites of learning. So there are features of current school systems that I think we need to radically rethink. But I don't want to get rid of schools. It depends what we think a school is. I think of a school as a community of learners. We learn enormously from each other. We don't learn in isolation. We learn from other people's ideas, from collaboration, from social contact, from not just the teachers who organize the learning, if they do, but from other students. Learning is a social process, and learning together, I think, is still going to be a major dynamic and has to be. It's in the natural way of things. But if we start from the idea that schools are communities of learners and then think, how are they best organized? They don't, like we are now, we don't have to be in the same space. We can be connected now through technology in the way that wasn't possible previously. There are all kinds of ways in which communities can become more dynamic schools. So I think schools, if we define them as communities of learners, are still the way forward. The need is to redefine what their features should be and how you try and coordinate those at a mass level.
Yeah, so it seems that really schools are not the problem, but what happens in schools, and that might need some change. Peter, you have experience in organizational change as well as an interest in education. Would you like to comment on that as well?
Well, first off, I agree very strongly with what Ken was saying, that the problem is not school. The problem is the mental model the word school evokes in each of us. Or to put it differently, the problem is not school. The problem is our experiences of school. I mean, we immediately think of a classroom, a teacher, a group of students. Students are mostly passive. The teacher's in front. The teacher has the answers. The student's playing a game. I'll never forget, I think our oldest son was about 8 when he came home one day, and he'd had an epiphany, and he said, I got it. It's about guessing what's in the teacher's head. So that's the problem. It's not school in the broadest sense. Ken hit a very important point. As soon as you asked the question, of course, I was thinking of different things. I was kind of noticing in my mind, like each one got ticked off one by Ken. The social aspects of learning. Learning is a profound process, and it's deeply personal and inherently collective. And I think you have to embrace both aspects. What is it that truly engaging for you and me? What is it that makes it deep and personal? I mean, we can all think of a teacher, maybe a few teachers in our lives who really shaped our lives, something connected with us very deep. But learning is always occurring, or almost always occurring, in a social context. You know, learning to walk occurs within a community of walkers. So that social dimension of learning is the very first thing I was thinking of when you asked the question the way you did. You know, if schools used to be the answer, you know, what's the answer now? I mean, one thing that I think a lot of people are really thinking about today, relatively new, I think we're a long, long way from starting to really create the configuration or the harmony that's possible, which is that in this age where more and more people, not everyone for sure, but more and more people have more and more ready access to information. Could school not, in fact, be even stronger or more oriented or more focused on the social dimensions of learning? You know, the wonderful thing about computer mediated or web mediated learning is you can do it when you're ready, and you can shape or co-design how that learning process unfolds. You know, some kids learn best at, you know, really in the afternoon, not in the morning. It's a classic example of what Ken was just saying. You know, why does school start at 7 in the morning? Where I live, you know, the kids are getting in their school buses at 6 in the morning. Now, you find me a teenager who wants to be up getting in a school bus at 6 in the morning, and it happens to be a girl teenager after she has to do whatever to get herself ready to be presentable at 6 in the morning. So just as a small illustration, the power, of course, of the technology today is that potentially more and more people can learn when they're ready in different ways in which they're ready. Thereby, school could, if anything, be more and more focused on the social dimensions, you know, doing things together, learning what it means to think together, to act together, to deal with the huge variety in ways we see the world. You know, the things that make the social reality not only important, but meaningful for us.
Great, thank you. I feel like that kind of ties into something that I see a lot coming up at the moment, which is the topic around peer-to-peer learning. And there is this kind of emphasis being put on the potential of peer-to-peer learning, and I guess that plays into this this point that you're both making around social processes and schools being more focused on the social aspects of learning. I was wondering if either of you, if you've got any specific examples of where this has happened well, that can kind of be used as a reference point for replication.
I have a hunch we do. Ken, would you like to start?
Well, I just also want to, in doing this, underline what Peter said about the just how deeply personal and social learning is. And if we start from that position, the role of education is to help people learn, and then we need to figure out what we want them to learn, what we think would be in their best interest. That's the foundation of a revolution in the way we think about school. You know, a lot of schools are organized the way they are because of the technologies that were available when they were conceived. And for example, one of the reasons education is not personalized as much as it could be is that until recently it was beyond the competence and comprehension of most people in a school to organize an individual timetable for, you know, the 1,000 kids that might be in the school. Well, we can do that now. I mean, it's very hard to do that with a ruler and a piece of paper and a pencil. I think, well, let's give every kid here their own personalized schedule. Actually, we can do that now. And so there are all kinds of ways in which the technology we have available can help to disrupt the old model to make it more resonant with the way people learn. The thing is, though, there are principles about learning which are age-old, that they haven't really changed that much. And I'm always keen to say that if we focus on teaching and learning as the heart of education, we actually do know what works. This isn't like trying to cure a new disease with no idea really where to begin. We've always known a lot about pedagogy, about learning, about the fact that people are natural learners. Kids want to learn, that they learn if they're curious, they learn if they're motivated, they learn if they're excited, they learn often better if they're working with other people, if they're active. And there have been, you know, numerous examples throughout the history of education in all countries of how that actually is proven to be demonstrably the case. I mean, there are all sorts of systems. I mean, years ago, for example, when I first got into education, my particular routine was through drama teaching. And drama in schools has always been a very powerful force, when it's been well understood and well facilitated, a very powerful force for getting kids to orient themselves to the ideas of other people, to explore their own sensibilities, to, it's really, drama is the art form of behavior, so to speak. And if you, I don't want to confuse improvisational drama with theatre, but if you look at what goes on in drama, whether it's in the classroom or whether it's a formal performance, the questions always asked in drama typically is, what would people do in this situation? How would they behave? Poetry asks related, but not necessarily the same questions. Drama is about action and social engagement. So what would you do in this situation? So the techniques of drama have a very powerful role to play in energizing kids' curiosity, in facilitating their interactions with each other, with deepening their understanding of how group dynamics work. I've worked in and seen drama techniques being used in some of the toughest schools in the world, and they have a fantastically transformative effect. Meanwhile, politicians who think they're trying to do the right thing for education, I imagine, they look at all the terrible social problems, the problems of disengagement, of dropout in education, and the way they think they should deal with it is by doubling down on sitting at desks doing tests. And it's a recipe for disaster, as we see. So there are techniques out there that we have always known work. Some of them are embedded in, as it were, proprietary systems. You know, the Montessori system, I'm not advocating one another, but Maria Montessori figured this out beautifully in Italy with working class kids over 100 years ago. Going back, you know, there was a whole system called the Playway. Anyway, I'm saying there are multiple examples. We're not starting from a blank sheet of paper where we know nothing. What we should be looking at are the principles of teaching and learning, and there are many examples to draw from, and then we should be organizing our systems around those rather than trying to look at more efficient systems and then trying to somehow squeeze in and accommodate principles of learning to which they're largely ill-suited.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, one way to break this kind of a stranglehold of our conventional mental models is to kind of try to go back to just what Ken is talking about, really deep principles of learning. The irony, as he said, is that in a sense, we know these because we're human beings. And when we just simply reflect on what really matters to us and what has worked for us as learners, we can start to tease these out. But we then need to kind of elevate them and make them clear and say, hey, do it in whatever way you want. There's a million forms, of course, but here are some guiding ideas. I think our education system is really bereft of compelling, powerful, and appropriate guiding ideas. Just to give you one example, back to your question, Jules, and I was thinking about, as Ken was talking about drama, this is a great example because it's a counterexample in the sense that very different subject matter. about probably 20 miles from where I'm sitting right here, is a guy who teaches algebra that we've taken many people to his classroom. 8th grade, algebra in the way the US system works, and it's not too different in many places, is kind of a key gateway. Kids who do poorly in middle school algebra often find their options for further math and science are reduced. And conversely, those who do well kind of get into the higher and more demanding subjects. But if you walked into Rob's classroom, his name is Rob Quadden, if you walked into Rob's classroom, you'd go, what's this? First off, he doesn't say almost a word. I mean, maybe speaks 4 to 5 minutes in every hour segment. Of course, his classroom, like Ken was talking about in our secondary schools, is chunked. He's got an hour a day with his algebra class. He has 2 or 3 different algebra classes. But first thing you notice, he's not in front of the room. Second thing you notice is the kids are all in groups. They're usually in groups of 4. And the last thing you'd notice is that the kids are really deeply engaged. In fact, when he doesn't, when I've been there a couple of times since he's hosting me and other math educators I bring along, he's busy saying hi to us. And he doesn't actually have to start the class. When the kids come in, they go to work. The whole class is organized. This has taken him 20 years. The whole class is organized around a set of very, very difficult algebra problems. He said the problems are difficult enough that even the best student can't do them on her or his own. So they work together. So they're basically working their way through a year's worth of algebra problems and helping each other figure out how to solve these problems. And what he's doing is walking around. So, for example, we all know that assessment's very important in any learning process, and we're all stuck with ridiculous systems where teachers have to wait for months to know how their students are doing for some tests. If it's a typical standardized test at the end of the year, like that's truly useless for the teacher. When the teacher needs to know how the kids are doing is every day. At the end of every day, Ken can tell you how all 30 of his students are doing, because what's he been doing for that hour? He's been walking around, listening to them, talking to them. It's really interesting. You walk into this class, the next thing you'll notice is you don't disrupt anything because they're all hard at work, working on their respective problems, and some are on problem 89 and some are on problem 28. It doesn't really matter the pace. They go at different paces. And then you'll notice that they're not really too concerned about your presence because they're so engrossed in their algebra problems. The other thing Rob does, the other thing is at the end, because he knows how all the kids are doing, every 1 to 2 weeks, he'll recompose the groups. So he has a kid over here who's really struggling with quadratic equations, and he has a kid over here who's actually quite good. He'll get those 2 kids together. So he's continually recomposing the teams. One of the interesting and I think important movements in education around the world is social emotional learning, really getting out of just focusing on the technical skills of things and saying, hey, isn't one of the goals of education to grow and to mature as a person, to be able to deal with conflict, to be able to deal with the people who are different, and to have a sense of my own emotional reality. When you go to Ken's class, go to Rob's class, you'll see that the kids are doing social emotional learning while they're doing algebra, because they're helping each other understand algebra. And so a lot of what he's doing, he said 90% of my work is understanding the interpersonal dynamics in my classroom. So I think that these kind of profound innovations in education can unfold in any subject. I mean, we're really only limited by imagination if we go back to principles. Kids learn best when they learn what they care about learning. Learning is social as well as personal. The old saw, best way to learn anything is to teach it. So if you can involve kids in situations where they're both learning and helping each other learn, you kind of bring in all those social factors, but you also deepen their learning. And it's active and it's noisy. And the kids are all engaged in conversations. So I think that this idea of could we really build some consensus today around a core set of learning principles and then start to make evident to people the extraordinary, virtually infinite variety of ways that educators can innovate around these principles to create really compelling pedagogy. Then I think we'd have some.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we're starting to pick up a lot of those concepts that we want to see in the future of education. And what I find fascinating is that actually we know what that is. And we know a lot of the things from old age. And we know that actually good teaching happens when the teacher almost doesn't have to be in the room. However, I want to maybe use this opportunity also to challenge our vision for the future, to unpack some of the fears that might come with that digital technology. So might there be, I will just restart this question, sorry. Might it happen that we experience an Uberization of education, where digital technology will be widely used in schools and teachers will be displaced as professionals and might only be brought in to share a specific snippet of their expertise? So could you see digital technology that should be enabling for better personalized learning turn the other way and actually take some of what we know is the good stuff in education that we want to keep and ruin that and take that away from the classroom? What are your thoughts on that?
I'll kick off. I mean, I think it's a bit early to think of Uber as a new paradigm. The reason Uber is so successful is because taxis are so bad often. You know, I mean, it's rushed in. Uber's it's a good example to draw from in the sense that Uber, which I use all the time, by the way, wasn't feasible 10 years ago. You couldn't have thought of Uber really, because for Uber to work, you had to have a system of smartphones. It just wasn't feasible. And new technologies do that. They make it possible to think about things you couldn't really think of properly before. I mean, some people can. And Newton worked out the equations that would be eventually necessary for a vehicle to leave the drag of the Earth's atmosphere and go to the moon. He did figure that out, but what he wasn't able to do was apply them to any practical technology at the time. All we had were horses and carts, and it would have taken an awful lot of horses going at very high speed up a very sharp ramp to have got out of the Earth's atmosphere. So, you know, there are some principles there, and what Uber's showing is there are principles of supply and demand and customer service and all of that. Whether it's, I don't know how instructive it's going to be for education. You see, I think that certainly one of the principles on which we should be rethinking education is the principles of personalization. And to me, it's almost a redundant thing to say that we should personalize education, because as Peter was saying earlier, I mean, what else could it really be? Education is a personal process. We're talking about human beings, and people learn if their appetite's stimulated, and if they have people who are able to fuel their curiosity in the right way and get them engaged and interested. We're not dealing with machines, we're dealing with actual people. So yeah, we should be personalizing education, which means a number of things. It doesn't mean, I think, that everyone should necessarily just learn what they want and have their own curriculum and pursue whatever happens to take their interest on the day. I mean, I think that should be part of it, but there are things that responsibly we want people to learn in common. There are things that we know that that may well be unappetizing at the moment, but it would be worth a while finding out about these things. And that's true in almost every field. There is something that generations have to pass on to each other, something that cultures want to convey. So personalization to me doesn't amount to some sort of undifferentiated free-for-all. It's about engaging people properly and understanding how they learn and giving them good reasons to want to learn things that are of interest to us as well as to them. So there's a whole thing that goes with that. I suppose the Uber connection is that it does give us access to all kinds. The technologies now give us access to all kinds of resources we didn't previously have. We can bring them into the classroom, and they do include the input of professionals and other people than professional teachers. I don't see professional teachers becoming marginalized or becoming redundant in a re-energized system of education. There has been, I think, a completely misguided view often that anybody can teach. I see it all the time. The way to improve the teaching profession is to hire people with good degrees, and that's all it really takes. And the assumption is if you've got a degree in French, that you can teach French, or if you have a degree in mathematics, you can be a superb math teacher. It's simply not true, and that's the example that Peter's given us of Rob. Being a teacher does mean knowing your stuff, but that's only half of what being a good teacher is. Being a good teacher is understanding pedagogy, it's understanding principles of learning, it's understanding group dynamics, it's understanding that teaching is not just transmitting information from my head into your head. It's a much more nuanced and complex and subtle process than that. So there are all kinds of people who are not in the teaching profession who've got a huge contribution to make to improving teaching and learning. Some of them may be naturally good teachers, some may not be. I ran a whole series of projects in the UK in the 90s where we worked with schools across the country, about 300 of them. And a big part of it was to bring in other professionals as well to work alongside teachers. It's a really good thing because it energizes the teachers, it makes them feel part of a bigger community. So I do think opening the doors of schools to other areas of expertise in disciplines is very important, but it doesn't remove the fundamental need for people to be good at teaching. And one of the enhanced roles, I think, of teachers as we go on will be to help other people bring their expertise into classrooms, but to give them the resource, the tools, and the support they need to do that.
Yeah.
Thanks. Peter, did you have something on that one?
Well, there's many facets of what we're talking about right now, but I'll just start with one of the more kind of obvious ones by virtue of the way you posed the question. This may be a little bit unique to the US or a little bit idiosyncratic in the US, I don't know. But what I'm referring to with this is this belief that somehow technology will transform education. And I think part of what's sitting in the background there is a general disdain. Maybe that's too strong a word, but I don't think it's entirely inaccurate. Certainly a lack of appreciation for teachers. You know, a tendency when things aren't going well and test scores aren't what they should be, or people think they should be, they're pointing the figures. Well, you know, the teachers, they're not really very committed. They're not very skillful, and you know, they're really quite a mediocre lot on the whole. We've seen a kind of the term I've heard from many teachers in the U.S. A deprofessionalization of teaching. And I think when teachers use that phrase, what they're referring to is what they perceive as a kind of a contraction of their professional autonomy. More and more required to do it this way, deliver this curriculum. And, you know, somebody will tell you, you know, the curriculum for the year is such that, you know, the only way we can get through it is to race, and we never hardly catch a breath. And so, for example, someone like Rob could only get away with what he got away with, which isn't a public school, by the way, because it was a relatively small school. He had a couple of really good colleagues doing similar things in different subjects, one of which was English, one of which was science. And he had a principal who said, hey, it all sounds crazy, but you guys are really into it. Give it a whirl. So he was in what he would regard as a genuine professional setting, where as a professional, he had a sufficient degree of autonomy to really experiment. And if it didn't work, you try something different. I mean, that's what professionals do. And I think with this deprofessionalization of teaching, this increasing lack of regard, I mean, it really was probably 2 generations ago where teaching was still seen as one of the most highly respected professions in America. It's certainly not that anymore. And then against that backdrop, you have all the buzz around technology. So it's kind of natural to think, well, the teacher, that's hopeless. That's the old system, and they're never going to be very innovative. Innovation equals technology. And so I am concerned, and I thought actually the way you posed the question was pretty good, because I think I'll just speak for myself, and I apologize for making an attribution about Ken. I was just about to. But I was about to say, people like Ken and me probably have the natural predisposition to see all the things that are possible, but maybe not to pay quite enough attention, let's call them the negative scenarios, the way things could unfold quite contrary to what we'd like to see. I mean, obviously, both of us share a belief that teaching is a profoundly important, complex, and potentially deeply enriching profession. the re-professionalization or the revitalization of teaching as a profession, I would put up very high in my list of priorities. So against that backdrop, we may not kind of really see the shadow of all this fascination with technology against the backdrop, as I was characterizing, of a declining regard for teaching as a profession. So just get rid of them and let the computers do it all. It's not really unlike what we've done with parenting, right? Well, you know, just give your kids a gadget, right? That's our parenting strategy 101. And you see it from the ages of, sadly, you know, a few months right on through. So the tendency to shift the burden to technology to solve these very deep social, human, cultural problems is, I think, a deep problem.
It seems to me that the essence of your comments is really to say that we need to remember that learning is a deeply personal process and that education is not done to anybody, but in fact, it's something that a person goes on a personal journey with, and it's a learning process that is created by the individual. And there comes in the role of the teacher that is important to remember, which is on one hand to be a very good facilitator, but also to be there as a guidance and an adult, maybe somebody to give comfort when learning is a bit painful and when it leads to realizations that aren't always joyful. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that it's. I think the Uber example is one that can be used if you take an analogy with the black cab industry in London. You know, there's a lot of discussion with that being a quality profession, and the black cabs are all quite cognizant that Uber drivers are paid a lot less, and once they've been driven out of the industry, then Uber can come in and dictate the pricing and actually have market kind of domination over that sector. And if education becomes increasingly privatized, then what would that do for the profession of education and the profession of being an educator? And that's where it leads me into a question, I guess, around professional development. And I think that Craig Johnson has pitched a question to you both about the importance of professional development. And if you could you give us an idea of what such professional development programs might look like in a kind of vision around education? And, you know, we've talked about this kind of enablement of educators, giving them that autonomy to really work to create that personalized environment for the learners. And how can we empower them to do that? Peter, maybe if you wanted to kick us off on that.
Well, I've had the opportunity to kind of look over the shoulders of a lot of masterful kind of teacher developers. I don't know what the best phrase would be, but basically people who design and facilitate, particularly teacher development in the domain of systems and understanding systems and how to bring a systems perspective into schools. So I think my kind of perspective and understanding here is quite narrow, but maybe it has some depth. First off, you know, it's the same principle applied to teachers. Imagine the teachers, like kids, are actually human beings, and they all learn in their own way. Imagine they're each individual. I'll never forget a lady who's been doing this for a long time, and I really admire her. She's really sharp. She said, you know, sometimes the best PD is we go out and have a coffee together. She said, I have teachers I coach who want me to come into the classroom and are even comfortable with me interrupting them in the middle of a lesson and go, you know, come on up and help me out. I'm kind of struggling with this. She said, that's a very unusual teacher who has that level of kind of, you know, personal comfort that in the middle of something in front of kids can go, gee, I don't think this is working too well. I have a coach here. Maybe she has some ideas. She said, so you go from kind of an active interventionist to a consultant after the fact. You know, you debrief a lesson you watch people do, to going out and have a coffee. So I think one is really to appreciate the variety of ways in which the human, in this case, human teacher, learns. Second is that, again, same stuff. What's the motivation? A lot of times, you know, teachers are being told, well, you should learn this, or we're going to start this new curriculum, and do you want to be one of the ones delivering it? Because if not, you may not have a job here. Whatever. So there's a lot of coercion, in a nutshell, rather than real aspiration. On the other hand, when usually teachers get a little taste of the kind of excitement of what we often call a systems classroom, like Rob's, where the classroom is a system, and that's Rob said my first big breakthrough was I said, oh wow, I'm surrounded by teachers here. What if I looked at this whole thing as a system, and the goal was every kid learns as much and as deeply as possible. So that's a compelling idea to a lot of teachers, but the second thing I've really learned is that it's difficult, and it naturally evokes fear. People are worried they can't do it. A big part of usually the identity structure of a lot of teachers, certainly beyond the age of 35 or 40, is competence. They're very concerned about showing up in front of students and not being competent in what they're doing. But then if you think about that hard, it's a great formula for never innovating, never doing anything that's really a big stretch. So if you're going to stretch, you're going to stretch into your domain of incompetence. So how to help teachers through the emotional challenges of really innovating their pedagogy. I mean, I described a classroom by somebody who's been at it for 30 years. So I've been at it for 3 or 4 years, and I think this is really interesting, but God, I'm clueless how to do it. I didn't exactly grow up with this system. It's not like I was educated this way from the age of 6 on, maybe in some schools, but certainly not in most. So it's a challenge. And the two things we've discovered about how to help teachers through that emotional one is, first, make the emotional challenge discussable. So you create enough safety that the teacher can actually say, we know this is like human development 101, I'm afraid. I'm really worried that I'm not competent, rather than having to keep that buried because it's not a very professional thing to say. And the second thing is that far and away the most powerful process or support infrastructure is strong peer networks, peer groups, not the organized professional learning communities that teachers are assigned to. We see that in schools all the time. You're now part of a PLC. And you go, well, why do I want to be part of that PLC? But peer support develops naturally through the process of people being interested, caring about each other, and wanting to be helpful, and being willing to be helped. So we found, without doubt, the most robust process to sustain teacher development through really challenging developmental territory is you got to have friends. You got to have other people who are doing it like you. I did say before that one of the reasons Rob was able to do what Rob was able to do was Al was in one classroom over here and Sarah was in one classroom over here. And he'd say, every time I tried something, it was a disaster. Rob and Sarah and I would sit down and talk. So that immediacy of a peer network that can give me the emotional support as well as the technical coaching and mentoring is really quite vital. And it's missed. I mean, you have this phrase common in the US, a drive-by PD, right? You're all going to be sent off to the 3-hour session on how to teach SEL. I mean, that's not professional development. That's not professional. It's not developmental. So really thinking about the developmental process and all the challenges is really key. If we want real innovation, it means real change. If we want real change, it means it's going to be scary and threatening for the people going through the change. How do we really account for that and support it?
That's, I think that I feel like we are approaching an elephant in the room to say that there's something potentially broken with the way professional development works, with the way standardization has affected the system, and with the effect that it has had on teachers and their confidence, especially in an era where digital technology opens so many opportunities that question the teacher as the source of authority in the classroom. So that elephant to me seems to be, we need to talk a little bit about the kind of policymakers in education. What does it take to create an education sector that innovates, that allows itself to be vulnerable, where teachers feel respected as professionals and can make mistakes?
Ken, do you want to kick us off on that one?
No, I do. Well, first, I do want to underline everything Peter just said, that about the social dimensions of professional development. I mean, educational development is professional development. The two are indistinguishable. It's been one of the big problems with the reform movement, particularly in America and in some parts of Europe and Asia, of the past 20 years. When I was an education student in the 70s, we had occasional lectures on comparative education. You know, when some hapless academic who happened to be interested in it came along to give our annual lecture on what was happening in other countries, nobody was really interested. And that was true generally. You know, I mean, people in Spain weren't much interested in what was happening in Norway, and people in Norway weren't much interested in what was happening in Alabama. But now they are, and education has become a big political issue. You find governments around the world scrutinizing each other's education policies and outcomes with the same interest. They scrutinize their defense policies. It's become strategic. And it's become strategic largely for economic reasons. And it's why we've seen this vast increase in attention to global league tables, like the PISA league tables, which have become, I remember saying something, they've become like the Eurovision Song Contest of education. And we all know what the Eurovision Song Contest has done for the quality of popular music, you know, which is really not very much. The thing is that the way that governments have chosen, for the most part, to promote education improvement is completely back to front and has misfired in almost every way. It's been based on a top-down model of management. We're going to tell you what to do. It's been based on a relentless program of reductionist forms of testing, which has fueled a multi-billion-dollar industry producing these things, which have had no practical impact or improvement on schools, whatever. They've had the exact opposite. And it's been a totally failed experiment in the countries that have chosen to adopt it. And the reason is that these approaches have misunderstood or betrayed all the principles that Peter's just outlined. Learning is a personal process. It's a social process. It's a collaborative process. And these systems of testing and standardization have promoted not collaboration, but competition. They've promoted not personalized approaches to learning, but impersonal approaches to learning. They've encouraged schools to game the system, to invent all sorts of areas of learning disability. You know, if you have a very narrow view of ability in schools, you automatically invent a huge conception of inability, and then you invent remedial programs to try and deal with the problem you've just created. I often have politicians saying to me, you know, we have all these problems of dropout rates in schools, of teacher disengagement, of kids who leave school without any sense of purpose or possibility. You know, how do we solve these problems? And I'm not being facetious when I say it. I say, well, stop causing them. That would help. You know, just don't do it. These problems are the result of the system. If you change the system, the problems go away. I mean, Rob's not having these problems in his classroom. He would have them if he sat the kids down day after day and drilled them in algebra that he found interesting and they didn't. Then he'd have behavioral problems to deal with. If you change the system, you don't get the problem. It's the consequence of the system. So what we have in schools now is particularly in America, we have a system based on competition, not collaboration. It's not a social process. It's not even a personal process for the most part. You know, kids learn in groups, but not as groups. And that's a very important difference. Yes. So the shift, I think, is, and by the way, I just want to say one other thing about this, is that when I've done a lot of professional development work most of my working life and worked with teachers in schools all around the place. And there is fantastic energy, professionalism, and expertise in the teaching profession. Teachers don't like this either. It's not like teachers are colluding in this system. They hate it. They know it's all wrong, and it creates the inimical conditions. And I often have teachers, superintendents, and school principals saying, you know, how do we change the system? Well, it's a really important conversation. One starting point for it, to me, always is to say to teachers and educators, is that, well, firstly, the system is changing. It's not fixed. It's what Peter and others would refer to as a complex adaptive system. It's constantly in flux. There are all kinds of emergent properties and destructive forces happening. It's not a homogeneous system either. There are wonderful examples of brilliant schools and amazing teachers all scattered throughout the system. The issue is the dominant culture with the system. People are forcing themselves against. They're trying to confront it. There are ideologies at work in the system which are constraining the change that need to happen. But it's a very complex system. And I always say to teachers, look, if you're an educator, if you're a school principal, if you're a superintendent or a politician, you are the system. You're a part of the system. It isn't something that's extraneous to you. If you're a teacher and you walk into your classroom in the morning and do what Rob and other great teachers do, if you get kids to sit in groups, if you give them practical things to do, if you change what you do, for those kids, you've changed the system, because you are the system for those kids. So you change what you do. It's Gandhi's thing, you know, be the change. If you do that, a lot of things that go on in schools are the result of pressure of legislation. Some of them are the results-oriented nonsense that people are having to contend with. But a great deal of what goes on in schools has got nothing to do with the law or legislation. It's not required. It's just a habit. We just do that because we always did that. You know, when people organize schools into 40-minute periods, there's no law says they have to do that. It's just a routine that we've got used to. And so as I see it, there's a lot of room for innovation in the system as it is already, if teachers and principals and superintendents are encouraged and given permission to think differently about what they do. There's a lot of room for change already. You can make changes in the system. You can make changes to the system. Or, as many people are doing, you can get out of it. You can do something else entirely. And that's why we see a movement into homeschooling and unschooling and alternative schools. People say, well, you know, we can't be bothered with this. We'll do something else. And why so many people are going online and leaving school early and decide to find some other way to do it. So the system is in flux. And the last thing I just want to say is, as I see it, and I know I make the assumption from what I know of Peter's work, which I'm a great fan of and I've admired for a long time, is that education, it's better to think of education as an ecosystem rather than as some kind of fixed mechanical system. You know, one of the things that I wrote a book recently called Creative Schools, and I was saying that I think when I talk about anyway, and other people do, about the industrial character of education, I think a better analogy for schools and human systems is not industrial manufacturing. A better analogy is industrial agriculture, because it's also dealing with living things. And industrial agriculture in the 18th and 19th centuries developed because of three things. One was mechanization, which made it possible to have vast tracts of single crops in a way we couldn't before. We developed industrial fertilizers to make them grow faster. And then we had to develop industrial pesticides because these things weren't being protected by natural processes. But it worked. But the thing about this is two things I just say. Industrial agriculture has been in some ways a great success. It's produced massive increase in output. The problem with it is it's all about output. It's about yield and output. Industrial farming, interestingly, is focused on the plant or the animal. And the price we've paid is that we have destroyed soils and ecosystems around the planet. We've destroyed water systems, and we're rendering our entire planet uninhabitable and unsustainable. It's the classic thing that the circular economy that you talk about at DIF is railing against. We are living in a way which is inimical to the planet's conditions for our own survival. Mm-hmm. And, it's worked, but hey, it's not going to work for much longer. The difference in organic agriculture is it works with natural systems. It promotes diversity. It promotes sustainability and eco systems which are mutually supportive. But the really interesting for me about organic agriculture is it's not focused on the plant. Organic agriculture is focused on the soil. You get the soil right, everything thrives. And I think what's happened in schools is we've become obsessed with output, yield, and along the way we have destroyed the culture of learning, just the way as we've destroyed natural systems on the planet. And the only way to get schools better in the way that we're describing it is to revive and revitalize the culture of learning. And that means understanding the natural process that we're trying to cultivate. And that's an ecosystem. We have to do professional development with schools, but we have to educate our legislators so they understand what their job is. And their job is not command and control, it's climate control. They've got to create a better climate in schools for people to do the job they're being paid to do. And by the way, it's urgent. We are running out of time here. I mean, we've talked a bit about technology, but all this is wrapped around with a very serious and impending eco crisis that education has to be part of in solving. There's a quote from H.G. Wells years ago in the early 20th century. He said that civilization is a race between education and catastrophe. I think he's exactly right. And all this nonsense we're talking about, right, improving standardized tests, I mean, it's really whistling while Rome burns. I think this could hardly be more urgent. And the way we fix it is to get back to basics, as people say, and those basics are about how people live, learn, and need to live together.
Thank you, Ken. That was really powerful, and it reminds me of one of the DIF headliners last year. We had a agricultural farmer in Brazil, Leontido Balbo, who produces organic sugarcane, and the summary, you've just summarised his talk beautifully there in terms of the focus on the soil as the enabler for a flourishing whole system rather than the yield. I'm conscious that we are coming to the end of our time together, and I just wanted to have the opportunity to ask if you collectively had any questions for one another, or any particular thoughts that you wanted to put out to the DIF audience before we close the session.
Well, I have 1,000 questions for Peter, because I've been admiring his work for years. But I know time is short. But if I've got one question, it's really just, Peter, do you see a wide take-up and understanding of the principles of how systems are working and how we have to change people's understanding of how they work? I find in my work, I get asked to talk not just to educators, but people in all other sorts of professions who are feeling the same problems and looking for the same shift. Is that your experience?
Absolutely. In a particular sense, I believe there's a kind of a deep, almost one layer below kind of conscious awareness, but it pops up in so many different ways. Feeling that, we're just not going to, we really don't have a long future living the way we live. As one kid said recently in one of the schools, we're screwed. And I think a lot of kids, believe it or not, I think a lot of kids really have that as a deep underlying conviction. We adds just a little more urgency to what Ken was just saying, that I think the gap between what it takes to live well, live harmoniously with one another, and that doesn't mean harmony, like everybody's doing something different, but there's harmony. People often forget that harmony is not produced by everybody singing the same note, with one another and with the larger natural world. It is evident to everybody at some level. And then it's a question of what's our various denial strategies. Not surprisingly, those with the weakest denial strategies will be the youngest. They haven't had a lot of time to become sophisticated in their denial strategies, and they have whatever speech they have about climate change or technology will save our butts or whatever. So I find you don't have to dig very deeply to kind of unearth this awareness on the part of young people that there are profound issues. And Jen, just to put an exclamation point on it as if it needs it, just look at the images of public leadership that they see. That's what they've got. Say, well, if this is what we got, I know we're screwed. So that in turn, though, creates a tremendous openness. And I think a lot of educators have the same feeling, because I think a lot of people have the same feeling. So to Ken's point, yes, I see tremendous openness. I see tremendous willingness to try things. I think there's a very delicate issue here that sits right at the heart, and you were kind of touching on it. It's really urgent, but if we approach it as urgent, we tend to screw it up. Somebody said it quite eloquently recently. He said, things are way too urgent to rush. And I think it's the sense of urgency that drives a lot of these really counterproductive reform movements that we've been talking about. We've got to fix it. We've got to fix the whole system. We've got to do it right away. So that kind of urgency doesn't help us. The kind of urgency we need is more this kind of deep sense that something needs to shift. And oh, by the way, I'm part of something. That kind of opens things. I spend a lot of time in China. Kind of one of the oldest kind of images that really helps, and we see it popping up a lot in China these days, is opening the heart. I mean, the traditional Chinese symbol for mind is actually a drawing of the heart. So this notion that our understanding and our awareness is somehow heart-centric, not brain-centric, which is actually quite a Western notion, that it's really this whole body understanding, and we really need to open ourselves. I think there's a tremendous opening occurring right now. In that setting, there's only two things that really are needed. One, you have to have tangible examples of what's possible. And two, people have to have a sense that they can be part of it. So you can't just live in a vague sort of hope state. You got to have hope and an idea. Well, let's work on this for a while. Let's see if we can make our algebra classroom a collaborative classroom, or let's just see if we can do this. So you got to have something that engages you, and that involves. That's why these principles we were talking about are really important. But the principles have to be juxtaposed with examples. One of the things that, of course, can happen very quickly in today's age with our technology is compelling examples can travel very quickly, much more quickly than ever before. So I think this is a paradoxical kind of thought I'm creeping up on, because this is possible precisely because of the distributed and kind of multi-centric nature of the technology. But on the other hand, we need something akin to curating. And, like, how do we keep dumb examples from propagating so widely, which of course we see a lot of. And that's where the role of organizations like Ellen MacArthur Foundation, maybe this conference, go. You can't control the bad examples spreading, but you can really focus your energies, intentions, and attention on the really good examples spreading. That old joke, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. We have to kind of see the places where the future is happening and make those more and more visible to people, and give people a sense that they too can join in creating this future. We're not short of ideas. We got tons of ideas. And with a little bit of thought, we realize we even have some guiding principles. But we got to get going. And it is way too urgent to rush.
Thanks. That's really powerful, Peter. Is there anything that you wanted to post to Ken as we close?
Oh, how can we see each other a little more often? We got to stop meeting like this.
We must do that.
The respect is mutual for sure. And as soon as I knew you guys wanted to bring us together, I thought, wow. And just to maybe underscore the social nature of learning for all of you, for me, this opportunity to talk is a huge, not opportunity, but it's really learningful. There's so much here. So yeah, that's it. I just wanted to say that. I wanted to say it at the outset because I knew it would be true, but it's easier to say it now.
Wonderful. That's what we hope digital encounters will always do, that they provoke a face-to-face conversation in some place or another. Thank you so much for this fantastic conversation. I think I have so many takeaways from this. One of them, I guess, is mainly about courage. I'm a trained teacher myself. I was teaching English for a long while, and this idea that in Chinese, xin is the same word for mind and for heart, and that teachers should have the courage to really work from the heart and be humble and make mistakes and try things out and speak to each other and start a revolution within their schools as organizations. I think that was really powerful for me as the essence of this conversation. What have been the most thought-provoking points for you, Jules?
Well, it's we anticipated it, didn't we, that it was going to be awesome, and it really has been such a pleasure. I think the pieces that really stood out for me was the aspect of social learning being an inherently social process, deeply personal and inherently collective. And Ken, you pointed out the guiding ideas, the guiding principles are potentially missing, and I kind of picked up what would be the guiding principles from this conversation. So we talked about personalization of education being a primary a guiding principle, strong peer-to-peer groups, networked groups, both technical sharing, but also emotional, to support on an emotional level as well, and around collaboration, not competition. And I think that plays to the kind of standardization and testing piece as well. And finally, maybe to say that being the change you want to see as an enabler for the professionals working in this really critical sector would be my takeaways.
Thank you so much for this conversation. A big thanks to everybody online for all the questions that you submitted via Twitter and email. I think I really could feel that sense of deep urgency that we need a revolution in education, and we've come up with a beautiful vision for that. While this conversation is drawing to a close, don't forget that the diff never sleeps, and there are still 7 days remaining. So check out what other sessions we have got lined up for you over the next week.
And Ken, Peter, thank you so much for your insights for this dialogue. It's been a real honour, and something I'll be reflecting on a lot as an experience. Thanks for watching, for the Diff audience, and it's over and out from here at the Diff Studios.